Good evening. Thank you all for being with us tonight. My name is Carmen Francelno. I am in the Engagement Services Department at the Evanston Public Library. I work as a Family Engagement Coordinator, and I am excited to present to you this evening our two guests who will be talking about the documentary Mandela in Chicago. I'm going to read a little bit about both, and then I will open it up to them for their presentation. So Ava Thompson Greenwell is an author, filmmaker, podcaster, professional coach, and journalism professor with more than 25 years of experience teaching, reporting, writing, and on-camera presentation at Northwestern University. She is the director of Mandela in Chicago, a documentary film about the city's anti-apartheid movement that was broadcast in February of 2021 and rebroadcast in February of 2022 on WTTW, a PBS station. She is the author of Ladies Leading, the Black Women Who Control Television News. She also hosts Ladies Leading, the podcast to celebrate and elevate Black women leaders in all professions. In addition, the former television news reporter leads workshops on how to manage microaggressions in the workplace. Some of her clients include Toyota, United Airlines, Academic Impressions, and Northwestern University. She's also a certified coach who helps people minimize distractions to maximize their talents to get the most of their professional and personal life. She holds a master's degree in broadcast journalism and Ph.D. in African American Studies. And that is Ava Thompson Greenwell. And then our second guest for this evening is Mr. Basil Clooney. He is the son of Jamaican immigrants. He was born and mostly educated in New York. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from City College of New York, specializing in Africa, and has a degree from Northwestern's Kellogg Graduate School of Management in Marketing and Economics with a joint major in international business. Much of his career was in housing administration at Northwestern University, while his real vocation has been in anti-apartheid and liberation support work in New York and here in Illinois, which has included the fight for Northwestern's divestment from apartheid South Africa. He worked with the Coalition for Illinois Divestment from South Africa and later with the Chicago Committee in Solidarity with Southern Africa during the 1980s and 1990s, and served as a team leader for the Independent Election Commission for the 1994 free elections in the Western Cape of South Africa. He served for 6 years as program officer with the Chicago State University of Minnesota Joint Honors Program in International Studies. He has taught at several colleges, including courses in American history, political science and critical thinking at Chicago State University, managerial decision-making at Keller Graduate School of Management, and colonialism and decolonization in Southern Africa at Columbia College, Chicago. So welcome our two presenters.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for being here today. And I'm so happy that Basil could be here because he is one of the main persons featured in the documentary. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of a trailer a little bit later. But first, I wanted to give a little bit of background about how the documentary came about and just some of the issues that are really important. So I'm going to share my screen and see, I think, Carmen, there's still some people trying to get in. So I think you will take care of that. Okay, so how did we even get here? So I would say in 2016, I began as a co-director of a program at Northwestern in the School of Journalism called the South African Journalism Residency Program. And as part of that program, we sent students to Johannesburg and Cape Town to work as junior reporters, essentially. And so in our undergrad and graduate program, I was the one teaching a prep course, getting them ready for going there and working there for a quarter. But in the process, my predecessor occasionally would bring in people from Chicago, South Africans who were living in Chicago, as well as people who had expertise. And of course, Basil Clooney and Prexy Nesbitt were two of those people. And so being from Chicago, it sort of dawned on me that, there are a lot of Chicagoans who either were born in South Africa or were involved in the movement to free South Africa. I wonder if there's anything that's ever really been done in terms of documentary and sort of pulling their story together. And so I began as a Diverse Voices in Documentary Fellow with Cartimquin in 2016 and really had nothing, no materials. And so within the course of, say, 4 years, things just really began to fall in place. And what I'm really proud about is that I was able to allow people to tell their stories of their involvement when Mandela came to Chicago in 1993, while they could still tell those stories. Because as of today, at least 6 people in the documentary have passed away. And so that's why it's so important to get their stories while they can still tell them. This is a quote from Mandela: "It always seems impossible until it's done." And I think that is so true. I want to give you a little bit of background about, let's make sure things are moving the way they're supposed to be here. Hold on, full screen. There we go. Okay, so just a little bit of history. This is the South African flag, and you notice it has lots of colors in it: black, green, gold, red, and white. And so, as you probably know, South Africa was colonized by the Dutch, then colonized by the British. And when apartheid fell in essentially 1990, initially, obviously, it wasn't always a smooth transition. And I think Basil will be able to talk about that a little bit more when that first democratic vote occurred. But just giving you the history, you can see what these colors signify. They signify sort of a coming together of 2 different groups within that country. And so even today, the Dutch still have a strong influence on South Africa. And there are 11 official languages in South Africa, and one of them is Afrikaans. And Afrikaans is a language that actually is derived from the Dutch. So a little bit of background there. This is the cell where Nelson Mandela actually spent most of his 27 years. And so got a chance to go to Robben Island during my many travels there. And you can see, this is, again, you see the mountains back here. This is Cape Town. And these are tourists who are visiting Robben Island. And this is where a lot of the prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, were held. This, of course, is 1990. And if you look at the date, February 11th, tomorrow is February 11th, and would be the 32nd anniversary of Nelson Mandela's release from prison. Now, when he was released in 1990, he went all around the world, including several cities in several cities in the United States, but Chicago was not one of them. And so one of the things that the documentary explores is why Nelson Mandela did not come to Chicago in 1990 and went to those other cities, why it took so long for him to get to Chicago. These are the number of miles from Chicago to South Africa. And I think this is important because it seems like such a long way, but in some ways, some of the issues that Black South Africans have been facing were just around the corner for Chicagoans, particularly Black Chicagoans. So many of the people in the documentary talk about the kind of US apartheid that they had experienced, either growing up in the South or coming to Chicago, and the kind of segregation that they experienced. And I think that was a real motivating factor for a lot of the people who got involved. And I'm going to stop right there for a minute and sort of turn it over to Basil, because I think this is really where people like Basil come in. You know, you heard from the bio that he is the son of Jamaican immigrants, grew up in New York. And so Basil, I wonder if you could say a little bit about, you know, how your upbringing actually informed your decision to get involved in the anti-apartheid movement here in Chicago.
Thank you very much, Ava. And I really appreciate being here. Maybe I can explain that with a little vignette. My dad was born in 1898. He lived to be 101 years old. And right after he passed, we found among his papers a newsletter that he and my mom had worked on in 1937, 1938. It was called the Jamaican American Industrial League. And the title of the newsletter was just the 4 letters, J period, A period, I period, L period, because they figured that as people of color back in the 30s, if you were advocating for the independence of Jamaica from Britain, you were going to go to jail in New York. So in that sense, I think I come about this in an honest way. One of the phrases we use is that you always stand on the shoulders of your ancestors. But the idea of fighting against colonialism, which is essentially the control of a certain people, whether it's a country, a full state or whatnot, by those outside, economically, politically, socially, is wrong. And we see today people are talking about the Russian state attempting to, or perhaps attempting to invade Ukraine. The same thing was true of when Britain and France and Belgium and the Dutch controlled most of the African continent. And growing up and understanding that that kind of injustice not only affected them, but also affected us. And later on, I can talk a little bit about things we found out right here in Chicago that was true, is what sort of made an impetus on us to work with folks who were seeking their liberation in Southern Africa.
And, just for the audience members, don't forget, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We have somebody monitoring those, and we will certainly have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But I think it's important to make that mention about how you were raised and where you grew up and how it informed you. I think for me, growing up on the south side of Chicago, I remember seeing the sign at Trinity United Church of Christ, Free South Africa. And I think I was in high school at the time when I saw that, and I didn't really know what it meant. And so doing this documentary was a full circle moment for me to actually go back and interview Jeremiah Wright about the background story as it relates to that sign. And by the way, the documentary is airing twice this month. It aired once already this past Sunday at 1:30, and it will air again this Saturday at 4 p.m. So again, speaking of oppression, and I noticed my screen was doing something a little strange there for a while. So this was a quote from Winnie Madikizela Mandela. We pretty much know her as Winnie Mandela, right? Birmingham, and this is when she visited Birmingham on one of the anniversaries there. Birmingham has always been an extension of our struggle. I was stunned by the similarities of the methods of oppression. The apartheid regime must have come here to take notes. Wow, right? And when I think about that, I saw this article and saw this quote that emboldened me even more to think about how oppression, specifically in Chicago, was connected to the kind of oppression that we were seeing in South Africa. So I think what's really interesting also today is, let's see if we can get this full screen again, is history, right, and memories can be very short. So for example, I'm curious, do you recognize this South African? That's right, it's Trevor Noah, host of The Daily Show. And for a lot of young people, they know who Trevor Noah is. And that goes for young people here in the United States as well as young people in South Africa. But what's interesting is if we don't tell the stories of Nelson Mandela and the people who really were involved in the trenches, people will forget. I was talking to one of the persons featured in the documentary. Actually, I was in South Africa the last time. It was in February of 2020, just before the pandemic. And Funeka Shishali was there visiting her sister. She lives in Chicago. She's in the documentary, but she goes back and forth, or she was going back and forth until the pandemic. And, she said to me, I am really afraid that young people in South Africa will forget who Nelson Mandela was. Now, in this country, we could probably say Nelson Mandela's name, and generally, people 40 and above would probably know who he is. But I would bet that people 30 and below probably know Trevor Noah more than they know about Nelson Mandela. Now, Trevor Noah wrote a book called Born a Crime because he is a biracial individual, whose mother was a Black South African and whose father was a white South African. And he talks about race a lot on his show and in any other platform he can speak on. And I think he's pretty honest about that as well. So I wanted to bring that to your attention because, there's some people out there who may not even know, that he is South African, but particularly our young people, it's important. So I'm going to share this trailer with you really quickly that comes from the film. Hopefully it will play the way it's supposed to.
My name is Harold Rogers.
My name is Joan Gehrig.
My name is Prexy Nesbitt from Chicago, Illinois, from the West Side.
Well, I'm Mike Saviwe Elliott.
I am Dr. Ava Carruthers. My name is Carol Mosley Braun. I grew up on the south side of Chicago.
There was a time when I filmed Nelson Mandela. It's called Labor Welcomes Mandela to Chicago.
I first heard about apartheid when I was in Nigeria.
And so I learned about South Africa as a child, really.
Free South Africa!
Comrades, I bring you the greetings of the African National Congress.
There was no question we had to bring him to Chicago because in 1990 he hadn't come to Chicago. So in 93, recognizing that absence, he made this trip. It was very important.
This is a great day for our city. Job is partially done, but it isn't finished yet.
He gave this incredible speech.
You have been the source of strength.
He was like a teacher, and we were all like in his classroom.
Okay, I think that's also a good place to stop and have Basil talk a little bit about what was it like to actually see Mandela in Chicago. I mean, you all have worked so hard over the course of decades. Now to actually see him be freed and see him in the flesh in Chicago. What went through your mind?
It was extraordinary, as you might imagine. And seeing him in person, he was such an extraordinary and gracious person who didn't mince words, who let us understand the nature of the struggle from their standpoint and our standpoint. One of the things that most people don't recognize or remember about our organization's work was that we were actually, I guess if you're from New Orleans, you call it second line people. We were actually following the wishes of the African National Congress and the Congress Alliance in, first of all, trying to push the divestment movement until we finally got that bill passed over President Reagan's veto in 1985. And then later on in doing support work in terms of fundraising and whatnot for groups in Southern Africa, because that's what folks in South Africa and Southern Africa were asking us to do. They said, what you can do is help us to, number one, publicize this and make it something known. It was over a series of 10 or 15 years. It was something that was never talked about, never understood, sub rosa, as it were, to something that became an important political issue. And once it became an important political issue, at least in Illinois, as it was in many other states, we pushed the people in the state legislature to make the divestment bill from Illinois an important issue. most of them had ignored it before. They had a way of going to the legislature and voting president, which meant they didn't have to take a stand on anything, but they got credit for being there all the time. We separated them into yeses, nos, and say nothings, and began to pressure them. We talked to their ministers, we talked to people in their communities, their teachers and stuff like that, and eventually made it a very important issue. That was part of the political work that was done. And again, this was the kind of work that was being done in South Africa to make fighting against apartheid something that became an issue that was so powerful that by the time you get to 1989 and 1990, the South African government was suing literally to try to release people from jail so that they could be seen as a recognizable state that wasn't such a pariah. And it was something that was extraordinary. By the end of that time, the worldwide condemnation had become so deafening that South Africa had to capitulate. And we were a small part of that, but a very proud part.
Well, I know people in the film have talked about this educational campaign that you had to do among Chicagoans. And I remember somebody saying, there used to be signs at the Bud Billiken Day Parade. If anybody knows about the Bud Billiken Day Parade, it's one of the oldest African-American parades in the United States. And that often they'd be at the parade with these signs saying, free South Africa. And people would say, well, free South Africa, free Chicago. We really have issues here in Chicago. Let's focus on those first. And so I wonder if you could talk about how challenging it was to get people to turn their attention, not just inward, but also to think about how they're connected to the African diaspora.
I'll be happy to. Again, one of the examples that really stands out in my mind is this. What was happening in South Africa under apartheid was affecting us here. And once you let people understand that, they began to see those connections. The state of Illinois building, that orange and blue spaceship there on Dearborn, was built largely with South African steel because slave labor under apartheid made it much more efficient for people to get their steel from there. This was happening at almost the same time that the Southworks steel plants were being shut down in the southwest side of Chicago and southern Illinois, putting thousands of Black and brown as well as white workers out of work. Once people saw those connections, they saw that apartheid was hurting us as well because of the kind of economic things that were working in tandem with one another. And it was our lawyers from CIDSA that really sort of opened up that understanding that, sort of brought it to light, as it were, and made it a public kind of thing. And the same thing is true of, very briefly, the same thing is true of the teachers' pension funds. There were pension funds from the teachers' union, from the police and firemen's union and whatnot that in the mid 80s was about $5.5 billion worth. And they were investing in apartheid South Africa. And once we pushed forward to let people understand that if you were a bank or a company that was investing in South Africa, we didn't want you to be able to use that money. And we had friendly banks and adversary banks. In other words, if you were a bank that was going to invest in South Africa, then you couldn't use our money to do it. And when you get to the pension funds that have those large amounts in them and stuff, we began to finally divest from the banks and move them to the banks across the street. That was also part of the struggle, an economic part. And again, it was making people choose between what they wanted to do. If you're going to invest in apartheid South Africa, then you can't be using the funds from the teachers and the firemen and policemen and whatnot here.
Well, speaking of money, and you mentioned earlier the Soweto Day and how these walkathons would occur in Chicago, both South Side and other parts of the city, to raise money to send back that money to South Africa. But also there was money raised, the Mustins, for example, a couple on the West Side, they would hold barbecues at their home. And this is, they were interviewed for the documentary. They would raise the money and then they'd send it back to those in South Africa. But then also some of that money was used to actually bring South Africans to Chicago to actually talk about what was going on there. And one of the women, this woman here, Lindiwe Mabusa, who actually had gone to college in Ohio, she was the key person for the ANC based out of DC, but will come to Chicago all the time. So on the left, this is Lindiwe at Operation Push, actually speaking. And so when Nelson Mandela was released, she spoke about how we are on the verge of victory. And then this is when Lindiwe, as you can see, she hadn't changed that dramatically. In 2019, I believe it was. Unfortunately, she passed away only a few months ago, but she was able to see the documentary before she passed. And actually, I had a world premiere viewing online, and she was actually on and was actually able to talk about what it meant to be involved in the movement, but also what it meant to South Africans to have Chicagoans also be so involved in the movement as well. Then there is Moses Maikiso. You mentioned Basil's jail and prison. You know, people could go to prison just for organizing against the apartheid government. And Moses Maikiso was one of those persons. On the left, you see what he looked like when he came to Chicago. And as a matter of fact, when he was delivering this speech to the UAW, he had just gotten out of prison, And so there were people all over the world, including here in Chicago, rallying to get people released from prison just for organizing. What's interesting is when I interviewed him, this was May of 2019, he had since founded his own political party called the African Democratic Change Political Party. What we had been finding since the ANC was voted into power is that the ANC has also been losing some of its power as other political organizations come along and feel as though the ANC is either not doing enough or not moving fast enough. And I think if you talk to many of the young people in South Africa, they in particular are not so fond of the ANC because they feel like the ANC has moved too slowly. This is a couple that I also featured in the documentary, a white couple who actually lived, a white South African couple who actually lived in on the south side of the city. And they still stay in touch with some of the people who were involved. This is Heather and Rob Peterson. And they too spent quite a bit of time on the south side. They were both fellows. She was working at DePaul. He was at the University of Chicago. Their daughter actually attended a predominantly Black elementary school. She was 9 years old when they moved to Chicago. And so they also have an interesting story to tell in the documentary. And then I wanted to share with you just a couple of images of South Africa, because I think often with African countries, you know, it's about the wildlife, it's about the elephants, it's about the lions. And yes, those animals are there, but this is a major metropolitan area. As you can see to the right, Johannesburg is known as the city of trees. And you can see all the greenery there. As a matter of fact, when we would go in February, you know, their seasons are the opposite. That was a great time to go because as soon as you land, it would be, you know, 80, 85 degrees. To the left, you can see the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital. And just during the course of going over several years, you know, it was being built. And I think the last time I was there, it was actually open for business. And they were actually taking, you know, pediatric patients. The commercialization that's there, right? You don't see a lot of chain restaurants, American restaurants, except for Kentucky Fried Chicken. But what you do see is, this was across the street from one of the major malls called Rosebank. And every time I would go there over the course of 5 or 6 years, I would notice something had improved, something was different, something was better. And so I think you see a lot of change in South Africa. But one thing that hasn't changed, though, is that there's still a lot of poverty. And so even though Soweto is a place that has a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, including upper class, upper middle class economically, it also has a lot of poverty. And so what you see often is a dichotomy. of very wealthy people, both Black and white in South Africa, and very poor people who are mostly Black. And so no indoor plumbing, no running water. And so as you can see, that could be quite frustrating, particularly for young people who've been told that since 1990 and since 1994, they could actually vote for their own government. Wanted to share a little bit. One year I decided to go into some of the schools, and one of the things you can see is pretty crowded in this classroom. I think that there were 36 children in the classroom. I remember the teacher came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, I would love to visit the United States." There was no teacher aide in this classroom. You see, in some cases, 2 students to a desk. And so in a lot of the public schools where the parents have to pay fees, it's still very challenging for the teachers and also very challenging for the students. At the same time, there are some creative approaches that are being taken. So to the right is the Chartwell Entrepreneurship School. And this school really focuses on business. It's run by a principal who believes that South Africa will get out of its challenges, its economic challenges, when more of its citizens become owners, business people. And so this school eventually wanted to go K through 12. When we were there, I think it was around a K through 8 school. And so they were working on adding new things each year. They also tried to incorporate aspects of business in every single class. So if it's an art class, then they're making things to actually sell to the local community. If it's a biology or science class, they're growing a garden and then selling some of that produce to the local area. So the emphasis was always really on how to be an entrepreneur. And then, as you know, there are considered certainly not just Black and white, but also a significant, what they call a colored or mixed race population. And this was an after school program in Cape Town. And so I always put this in because I think it's important to show that just like here in the United States, there are organizations, social service organizations that are not tied to the government, but it's people who are trying to make their community better. And they were running an after school program there that I thought was important to demonstrate. And then again, on the creative side and doing some different things, this is Molomalaba School, which is in Khayelitsha, which is near Cape Town. This is an all-girls school. And these were girls who were in kindergarten and first grade. And these were the 8th grade girls. And you can see smaller class sizes. They have on t-shirts of the school. And they were actually singing a song for me, an a cappella song, the national anthem. So one of the things that I was hoping that Basil could talk about too is what it was like to go back in 1994, first free or democratic elections. And you were one of those election observers, if I remember correctly.
Yes. That was even more inspiring than seeing Nelson Mandela come out of prison, because we were there. The African National Congress had asked for 10,000 volunteers from around the world to ensure a free and fair election, that is election monitors. And I'm proud to say that of those that went from the United States, maybe 2/3 of us were African-American. It was not something that was paid. We had to sort of cobble the money together ourselves, each of us. But it was it's quite an extraordinary thing to witness an election nationwide. I mean, we saw people lining up by the hundreds of thousands throughout the country so that they could cast their first votes. And we were in the Western Cape, which is mostly a place where Khoi people live. They're sort of a mixed race folks who they're called San people as well. And in the cities that we were at, every industry, it was a farming area, every industry was owned by a white farmer, and every Khoi person worked for a white farmer in that whole county. And the first day of elections was what they call special elections. People went into prisons, they went into nursing homes, places, hospitals, places where people couldn't get out to the polls. And one of the fights that took place between 1990 and 1994 was who could vote, whether or not you could vote if you'd been convicted of a crime and what crimes, whether you could vote if you were 16 or 18 or 21 or 25. They fought about everything in terms of setting up the nature of the election. So the first day we go to the prison in that county seat, and there were about 160 men and about 60 or 70 women in that jail. Every single one of them was from that one ethnic group. There were no blacks, no Asians, no whites. They were all Khoikhoi. And you realize that this was a community where you could only commit an economic crime by not working for a farmer or choosing not to do that or being in the county and you didn't have a job working for one of these guys. It was very much like what you saw in the United States in the 40s with sharecropping in many of our southern states, is that if you were not part of a system that somebody else set up, you were automatically a criminal. It was extraordinary to sort of see that and understand that. It was like everybody who came out to do their first vote was like a cousin of somebody else. It was mind-boggling. In any event, it was so exciting to see people voting for the first time. I remember one man who came in on a stretcher. He was in his 80s or 90s. He couldn't walk. They brought him in on a stretcher. And again, in this area, people spoke Afrikaans. And the ballot itself had 27 different parties on it. Folks were trying to make it as difficult as possible to cast a reasonable vote. There were parties that somehow got vetting throughout the country, the KISS party, the Keep It Simple Stupid party, the marijuana party, a whole bunch of extra things in addition to the main political parties that were there, the African National Congress, the apartheid government party, the Democratic Party, things like that. So we had 27 different people on the ballot. And they worked out this extraordinary ballot. If you have a chance sometimes, you ought to go and Google the South African ballot from 1994, and you will see what people did. They had the face of the leader of the party. They had the acronym of the party. They had the full name of the party, and they had the party symbol. So that regardless of how, again, this is in a country where a lot of people were illiterate, but not being able to read doesn't mean that you don't know what you want. And so that was the way of getting across. If you were voting for the Nationalist Party or something, you saw the clerk's face there. You saw the NP sign. You also saw the name written out, and you could tell immediately who you wanted to vote for. And many of these, getting back to the place in Ladysmith Cape where I was, many of these Khoi people had been told, the farmers, I mean, they did the right thing. They brought them into the polls, but they've been telling them various things. And time after time, you get to somebody and ask him in Afrikaans, "Weisstem, who are you going to vote for?" And he'd look up with a scared look and say, "Divestment, the white one." But of course, there were 7 or 8 different white people on the ballot. They were told to do that. Some of them paid attention to that. On the other hand, this old man that came in on a stretcher, we had to bring the ballot down to him. It was a little triangular kind of thing. The ballot box was triangular. We had to bring the thing back down to him, and he didn't even look at it. He looked up at us, and in a strong voice, he said, "Mandela," just like that. And to me, that was the epitome of what it meant, the differences between people being told who to vote for, those who knew exactly who they wanted to vote for, and yet everybody wanted to participate in this. And so when we look at today's situation in the United States, with so many different groups that are trying to prevent folks from voting,
voter suppression
in an easy manner, voter suppression, gerrymandering, every kind of way possible that people are trying to prevent us from voting, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of democracy are we going to have if we let this happen to us as well? And we already have what they were looking for and fighting for. Anyway, that's my take on that.
We want to open it up to any questions that you have. So make sure you put them in the chat. And while you're thinking about them, one thing I think is really important to think about, and I think Cheryl Johnson Odom, who is also an Evanstonian, talks about this in the documentary, is to provide perspective. Even though South Africa may not be as far along as people would like, it is still a very young democracy, right? And you think about the United States, how old its democracy is, but yet we're still facing some of those same racial inequalities in a variety of ways. And so I think she put that in context and did a very good job in the documentary of making that clear. And so I know that South Africa, I know, Basil, you have traveled back several times since 1994. I've been there more recently as February of 2020. I wonder what your thoughts are on that in terms of the progress that South Africa has made and where it still needs to go.
It's a difficult process. I think people in South Africa have sort of understood this in a way that it sounds a little bit kitschy, but it's not really. The talk that or the phrase that people used to use during the time when they were struggling for independence was came from the Portuguese colonies that fought against, or the African colonies that fought against Portuguese colonialism. A luta continua, vitória é certa, which means the struggle continues, victory is certain. And as my colleague and mentor Prexy has told us often, now more often you hear people saying in the aftermath of that and the understanding of the difficulties that come when you actually have to rule a democracy that has so many different things going on, they've reversed that to say victory continues, but the struggle is certain. And so they understand in a very real way that just winning independence is just the beginning of something, and you have to work much harder at that. And yes, as you mentioned before, it's a mixed bag. There's some things that are going very well, others are not. I mean, one of the continuing things that works against South African success as a country is that as rich as the country itself is, as the society is, you still have this tremendous difference between the super rich and those who are at the bottom of the economic and social barrel. And there don't seem to be very many ways of creating pathways to more kinds of equality of life. I mean, we struggle with that here. I mean, we've in the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen that the folks who accumulate billions of dollars have become much stronger, not only much richer, but they become a much stronger part of what the political economy is. And so we really have problems with that here. So it's not an easy thing to do. And yet, on the plus side, one of the groups of folks as a category of people who have been fighting most successfully are the women, the market women, those who are caretakers, those who, as you mentioned, who work in social services. These are the people who have struggled most often at the bottom of stuff, even before apartheid was fought. I mean, they used to talk about the three colonialisms: black versus white, rich versus poor, and male versus female. And so very often the caretakers, the women in society, are those who have the most creative and understanding ways of making life much more reasonable at the local level. And I think we need to look at that. I mean, it happens not only in South Africa, but in India and very many places where poverty is endemic. You see people working tirelessly to make things better. And that's one of the hopes of that society as well as others.
Well, Basil, you make the point of the wealth disparity and the wealth gap. I mean, it is real. South Africa has one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world, and that Gini coefficient measures the disparity. So you got the uber rich there, and then you got the uber poor there. And visiting there, I've seen that up close. One year we visited a family, and we walked in, and they had maids to greet us. And the house was on a hill overlooking the city. I mean, it was the most beautiful home I've ever seen. But then right next to it, there was a township of extreme poverty. And so imagine if you're the person who's living in extreme poverty, and every day, you know, a couple of miles away, there's this super uber wealthy. It's going to create some tension. And I think what we saw this past year, right? South Africa had a major uprising just this past summer, so summer of 2021. Of course, this was in the midst of COVID. And if you've been following the news lately, you know that South Africa was the first country to identify the Omicron virus and said, hey, we found it here. And then my friends in South Africa were texting me saying, hey, wait a minute, we did the right thing by saying that we found this, but now you're shutting down the country, or you're shutting down flights to our country when we need that commerce there. I think also one of the issues that our students have faced going there is, crime. Just like crime is rampant in the city of Chicago, and whenever you're going to have those kinds of disparities, you're going to have high rates of crime. So in some ways, it's no different than what we see here in the Chicago area. I also think that there's a lot of political corruption, but there's a lot of political corruption here too. But there, the political corruption impacts the infrastructure. So let's take electricity. They have what we call load shedding, what we would call here in the United States, brownouts or blackouts. And so they actually have an app. Now, if they can create an app to tell you when your electricity is going to be on and off in certain regions of the city, then you would think they would be able to fix the grid. But that's been an ongoing issue, but that affects commerce and entrepreneurship. People need the internet. If they don't have internet, if it's down, then they can't run their cash registers. I remember we were at Kruger Park one year, which is the game park that everybody knows. The electricity went out and we couldn't purchase anything, for about 15 minutes until the electricity went back on. We were at a restaurant one year and this restaurant did not have a backup generator. And so guess what? The lights went out and it was candlelight for real. And we really, really used that candlelight to actually have our meal. So those are some of the real problems, right, that South Africa still faces. I know Carmen is on and she's going to unmute for anybody who would like to ask a question, but I do see a couple of questions in the chat.
Yes, there are a couple actually.
Yeah, so where are the Mandela children, right? So unfortunately, several of them have passed away. So in that photo that I showed, let me see if I can find that photo again. That's one of those. Well, it was actually in the trailer with Jesse Jackson, Harold Rogers, it was Nelson Mandela, and it was his two daughters, Zinzi and Zanani. And unfortunately, Zinzi passed away. And I think that, let me make sure I've got that right, whether it was Zinzi or Zanani. I think it was Zinzi, because she was the one who was an activist. She was, very much an activist type. And if you watch some of the movies, you'll see that that she was featured in some of those movies. So it really is one of those things that a lot of these people are passing away. So yeah, Zanani Mandela is actually still, she was born in 1959, and she is actually a South African diplomat. And if I remember correctly, I think she lives on one of the islands near South Africa, near the coast. Let's see, somebody else with a question. What is the status today of the international connections of the this question comes from Robin, of the African diaspora, of the international connections. I think if I get your question correctly, Robin, I think you're asking about South Africa's relationship to neighboring African countries. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Well, there are a lot of border countries. For example, Zimbabwe, right, is one of them. And one year, our students went, they do reporting projects, and they did a project on Zimbabweans who had immigrated to South Africa. So even though there are problems in South Africa, it's still better than a lot of the other African countries. So you have loads of immigration. When I go there, if you go to any of the markets, you'll meet people from Mali, people from the Congo, people from Namibia, people from Zimbabwe, people from all over. And at one time, it was estimated that as many as 1 million Zimbabweans had fled their country and come to South Africa. And it actually has been the source of a lot of tension, right? And even violence. A few years ago, they had a lot of skirmishes that were going on between the African immigrants who were coming to South Africa, because South Africans felt like, well, we don't have the resources that we need, so how can we give more resources to others? So I think it's a very complicated mix of, you see progress on the one hand, but then you see a lack of progress in other areas. So I don't know, Basil, did you want to add to that? Because I know you visited a couple times as well, and you may have seen something different.
I agree with you completely that this is a problem that unfortunately is probably going to get even worse. I mean, we look at large factors like the Omicron crisis and climate change, and we realize that climate change affects especially if you live in rural areas or in areas that are subject to farming and animal growth and whatnot. When you have floods, when you have heat waves, droughts, all of those kinds of things, people are driven off their land, and they will go any place where they think they can get something better. And folks who are already stressed, seeing other folks come in, are seeing the same thing we're seeing in our southern borders, although it's very often, as you said, between people who are in one territory, seeing folks coming in from another territory, rather than a government border patrol kind of thing, as we've so often seen here. But there are a lot of people that live in the southern states in the United States who are not necessarily border patrol people, who feel the very same way about folks coming into the United States, especially if they're at the lower end of the economic scale. So we're seeing this happen more and more as climate affects how people live and eats away at resources that are scarce already. And so I don't have a lot of faith that this is something that's going to be very easy to address. I think it's going to be on a continuing basis, and part of it is going to depend upon very creative kind of solutions that increase infrastructure within countries, so that people who are working at recreating roads and bridges and things like that can be put to work. And it's going to take money. It's going to take money from governments and from industry to pay those people, so that as their lives get better, they then feel less constrained about, maybe it's a Pollyanna way of looking at it, but less constrained about trying to find scapegoats for their bad living situations. But yes, immigration is a major thing that's going to take place in
and
lots
so
of the world.
we were seeing lots of headlines about xenophobic attacks, and that's what that was about. It was about xenophobia, in South Africa. And to your point about the environment, and water is a precious resource. We take for granted to turn on our faucets here to go get a glass of water. But a couple of years ago, there was a severe drought in Cape Town, where we sometimes send students. And we that year debated on whether we should send students, because people were being rationed water. They could only, wash their clothes maybe once or twice a week. The hotels were telling people, if you come to a hotel, we're not going to be exchanging your linens and things like that, every day, maybe once a week. And so that was a real issue and a real challenge. Some universities in the United States actually decided not to send students that year, because on the one hand, the students help the economy because they have to eat, they have to have a place to live, and they have to pay for that. But on the other hand, they put a strain on the limited resources that are already strained because of the number of people who need water and need, just water to drink. So that was a very scary time, I think, for anybody who was traveling to the country, but certainly for the people who had to live with it every day. Let's see, I see a couple of other questions. We have two other questions that were shared.
I actually have one that was shared with me directly too.
Oh, okay. Is that, okay, so this one, was that the one, what was the pivotal point for divestment in South Africa? I think, Basil, you might have some perspective on that.
Well, I'm not sure if we can point to one particular pivotal point. I think that generally, at least here in Illinois, we saw that the more that that people understood what was going on, the more that we had stuff like, for instance, many of us would debate folks on WTTW and other places. from time to time against Caterpillar and other people who were in fact supporting the South African regime at the time. That helped a little bit. I think when people sort of found that as companies began to get more and more pressure, companies like Polaroid and Kodak were instrumental in providing the instrumentation for the pass system that was so hated in South Africa. Their own employees were ones who went there and reported back and forced changes in the company to have them deselect that. Ford and General Motors and companies that were making vehicles and stuff. The South African government would turn those into military vehicles and whatnot, as well as the British Saracens and whatnot. So more and more, as companies began to sort of feel pressure, they began to divest, and you saw a reversal of the idea that that was at the very beginning, that nobody knows anything about this problem and you don't have any right to say anything about it. It's our bailiwick. As more and more companies began to divest and find that it was too much of a hassle to continue to fight against public relations, then you began to see the companies pulling out. And the other thing that took place was a very important one, was that American television began to look at what was happening in South Africa at the local level. I remember when after Trans-Africa started their Thanksgiving campaign by sitting in various consulates and stuff, American companies, ABC, NBC, and CBS began to look at what was happening in the townships. And when people saw folks being bulldozed out of their homes, that really made an impression, as significant as the impression of when American television first went into Vietnam and showed what was happening with soldiers being killed on the ground there. When people saw that in their living rooms on the news, that was an extraordinary thing. I don't know if that was the turning point, but that certainly was a big situation that took place that let thousands and thousands of people in the United States understand how apartheid worked and why it was something that needed to be addressed.
I think there's one last question, and then I'm going to give that reminder, and that was about the West. How has the West had an impact on how South Africans live, and how do they view the U.S.? Well, I mean, America has an impact on culture everywhere, right? Especially in South Africa. I know just in terms of the clothing that people wear, hip hop culture is very big there. Music. I remember one of my students did a story while interning there about how the government had banned foreign music on the radio because they felt like foreign music was getting so much attention that the South African artists weren't able to get much attention. And so the impact, again, you go in restaurants, again, the impact of music is just huge. It's just really, really tremendous. I think in terms of how they view Americans, I think they want to come to the United States. They still think of the United States as a place to aspire to come to. And I don't know. I remember when I was there when Trump was in office, they were asking me, why did you all vote for him? That was the question that I got a lot when I was, and I was like, I didn't vote for him. But the point was they were seeing America, I think, from a different perspective based on some of the policies. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Basil.
I don't think I can. I think, as you said, America has an outsized influence on the rest of the world by who we are and what we do, our television shows, everything that we do. And I think the rest of the world is also wondering how our politics, how our economy, how our society is changing now that they see on their own television sets how dysfunctional our legislature has become in terms of being able to move us forward together. I think that's something that is yet to be seen, but I think that we shouldn't expect that nobody else around the world sees or understands that or has their own opinions about that.
And I would say social media is a big driver of how people, especially younger people, see the United States, and how the United States sees other countries, including South Africa as well. Well, I wanted to remind you all that the documentary Mandela in Chicago airs a fourth time this Saturday at 4 p.m. on WTTW Channel 11. And I also wanted to remind you that in 2 weeks, I'll be back. And this is the next virtual author discussion with me. And I'll be focusing on my book, Ladies Leading, the Black Women Who Control Television News. You can get the link, I think, from the library's website, register like you did for today's event. And I'll be talking about how this came about and some of the things, some of my discoveries and what I learned in putting that book together. I want to thank Carmen so much, and also Basil for joining us this evening, and particularly for Carmen for reaching out and saying this is something that we should talk about in our community. And I certainly appreciate all the people who decided to join us tonight. Carmen, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. There is one last question. I think it'll be a quick question for you, Mr. Clooney. Did your parents have any connection with the UNIA?
My father was a Garveyite. Yes, he was. And he came to the United States about the time when Garvey was in trouble with the US government for trying to set up the steamship lines to take African Americans who wanted to go back to Africa. But yes, he was very strongly a Garvey man. And I learned a lot about that from him. And it was an extraordinary thing when I first did a story on Garvey, or not a story, a paper on Garvey in high school. And I went to the Encyclopedia Americana, and I found a completely opposite story of what my father was telling me about what he was trying to do. In the article, it was nothing about that at all. It was that this was a crook who took Black people's money and was sent to jail and deported and so and so. And I said to myself, now either my father was lying or the encyclopedia is lying, because these stories are completely opposite. And I needed to find out which one it was and why, which was the most important question. And so it was years before Black Moses and other books about his life had come out. But that was the story that was put out about this person who had the temerity to decide that US policy about bringing people here against their will was better than the policy of us going back if we wanted to. So, I mean, it's a whimsical way of looking at it, but yes, he was.
Well, that's an important question, because Mike Saviwe, who also was in the documentary and who also passed away last year, talks about the influence that Garvey had on his father and grandfather, and the impact that he chose to continue carrying out as he became the unofficial videographer really of the anti-apartheid movement in Chicago. Had it not been for Mike, a lot of these images that you see in the documentary would not exist. And so I want to give a shout out to him. Hopefully he is watching and is feeling the fact that we are so appreciative of the documentation that he left for us to be able to see what it was like and to see who was actually doing the work.
Thank you both so much for being here and sharing your stories and your information. I have watched the documentary twice, and so I highly recommend it. I feel like I got more information the second time after watching it again. So I highly recommend it. Again, it is airing on Saturday, and I watched it on pbs.org, so you can catch it there too.
Yes, I was going to say it is available online. So if that time does not work for you, if you just Google it, you'll find it. It's still on the website in its entirety.
Yes. So thank you all for being here tonight. I hope you enjoyed this. And
you're welcome. And thank you for
evening.
having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.
All right. Good night.